The day I buried my only son, I thought the pain would consume me whole. My heart shattered into pieces so small, I didn't think I could ever breathe again. He was my world, my reason to keep going. And suddenly, he was gone. At the funeral, I clung to his memory, drowning in grief. That's when she came to me, my daughter-in-law. She wrapped her arms around me, whispered promises of family, of unity, of standing together in the darkness. For a moment, I believed her. For a moment, I thought I wasn't alone. But masks never stay on for long. The very next week, her voice changed. The pity in her eyes turned to contempt. She started snapping at me, calling me weak, a burden. She looked at me as if I was nothing more than an obstacle standing in her way. And then, she said the words that cut deeper than any knife. "This house isn't yours anymore. Pack your bags." In that moment, the woman who once pretended to be my family revealed her true face. And I stood silent, carrying both my grief and the first sting of betrayal. Just days after the funeral, when the flowers on my son's grave were still fresh, and the air still carried the faint scent of lilies, my life changed again. This time in a way that felt almost as cruel as his passing. I had lived in that house for decades. The walls had seen my laughter, my tears, my late nights waiting for my boy to come home safe. It was more than wood and bricks. It was memory, family, love, and the echo of a man and a child I had lost. My husband's laughter still seemed to float in the hallways, and my son's footsteps lingered in the creaking floorboards. But none of that mattered to her. My daughter-in-law came to me with her sharp eyes and her sharper tongue. No softness left in her voice. No trace of the comfort she pretended to give me at the funeral. She stood in the doorway of the living room, arms crossed, her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like a sneer. She said flat and cold, "You need to leave. This isn't your home anymore." I blinked at her, not quite believing the words had left her mouth. My son had been gone less than 2 weeks. My grief was still raw, my heart still bleeding, and here she was, stripping me of the last place that connected me to him. I tried to gather my voice, but before I could, she stepped closer, her words cutting deeper than knives. "You're a burden," she spat. "Everything now belongs to me. You heard my husband's will. You get nothing. This house is mine. I don't need you hanging around dragging me down." A burden. That word clung to me like chains. After everything I had sacrificed for my son, after all the nights I stayed awake nursing him through fevers, after the decades of scrubbing, cooking, and working to build a home he could be proud of, now I was just a burden. Her eyes scanned the room like she was already planning where to redecorate, as if I were just an unwanted piece of old furniture taking up space. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout that this was my home long before she ever stepped foot inside. That my husband and I built this life from scratch, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, sacrifice by sacrifice. But the words caught in my throat. My grief held me silent. Instead, I walked upstairs, my legs heavy, my chest hollow. In the quiet of my bedroom, I looked around at the familiar things I had touched 1,000 times. My husband's old dresser, the framed photographs of my son's first day at school, his graduation, his wedding. They were more than objects. They were pieces of a life that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. With trembling hands, I opened my closet and pulled out a suitcase. The sound of the zipper echoed like a funeral bell. I folded clothes slowly, almost mechanically, each movement accompanied by tears that blurred my vision. Packing my bags was not just about leaving a house. It was about being exiled from a life I had built with love, from the memories of the people who mattered most to me. Each sweater, each scarf, each pair of shoes felt like another goodbye. Downstairs, I could hear her humming to herself, as if my pain were nothing more than background noise. I could almost hear the smirk in her voice when she spoke on the phone, probably already telling someone how she had taken care of me. When I finally carried my bags down the staircase, I paused at the bottom step. I ran my fingers along the railing where my son's little hands once slid down as he raced to the kitchen for breakfast. I looked at the wall where his height had been marked in pencil every year on his birthday. Those marks were still there, faint but real. They were proof of a childhood, of a life I had nurtured, of love that no one could erase. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I whispered to myself, "He would never have wanted this." And I knew that was true. My son loved me. He wasn't perfect, no child is, but he was kind. He was grateful. He would never have wanted his mother tossed out like garbage, especially not while my heart was still bleeding from losing him. I turned toward the door, and she was standing there, arms folded, smirking as if she had already won some great battle. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes said it all. "You're nothing now. Get out." So I walked past her, head bowed, clutching my suitcase handle so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Each step away from that house felt like a betrayal to the life I once had, but I had no choice. Outside, the world looked the same. Children played in the distance. Birds sang in the trees. The sun shone overhead. But for me, everything had changed. I was homeless in the truest sense of the word. Not without shelter, perhaps, but without the one place that had ever truly been mine. I stood there for a long moment, suitcase at my side, breathing in the familiar scent of the roses my husband had planted years ago. They were still blooming, still alive, still holding on, unlike the family I thought I had. As I walked down the sidewalk, I told myself again, my son would never have wanted this. It became a mantra, a small flame of comfort in the cold wind of betrayal. But deep inside, beneath the grief and the heartbreak, another feeling began to stir. Something quiet but powerful. It was the sense that this wasn't the end of my story. That no matter how hard she tried to erase me, my son's love was not gone. And one day she would learn just how wrong she was. For now, though, I walked away in silence, my heart heavy, my soul wounded, my tears falling freely. I had been forced out of my home, but I would never be forced out of my son's memory. After I left the home I had lived in for decades, I thought maybe, just maybe, time would soften her cruelty. Grief, after all, is supposed to bring people together, not tear them apart. I told myself that perhaps my daughter-in-law's sharp words came from her own pain, her own loss. I wanted to believe that somewhere inside her was the same broken heart I carried inside me. But I was wrong. It didn't take long before her mask slipped completely. At every family gathering, every dinner, every small event where relatives came together, she seemed to take it upon herself to remind everyone of my new place in the world, or rather of the place she thought I deserved. I would walk in quietly, still trying to adjust to life without my son, still trying to find meaning in a house that no longer echoed with his laughter. And she would be waiting. Her tongue was a weapon, and I was always her target. One evening, we gathered at her sister's house. The table was set beautifully. Roast chicken, fresh bread, salad with glistening tomatoes. I sat at the end of the table, my hands folded in my lap, trying not to take up too much space. She leaned across the table, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, and said, "I don't know why she bothers coming. She's useless now. She has nothing. Broke as the day she was born." The room fell silent. Forks clattered against plates. My cheeks burned, and I stared down at my napkin, pretending I hadn't heard. But I had, and so had everyone else. Her words didn't stop there. At another gathering, when my cousin asked gently how I was coping, my daughter-in-law cut in before I could answer. She laughed, a sharp, cruel laugh, and said, "Coping? She's barely hanging on. No money, no home, no future. My husband made sure I'd never have to worry, but she's got nothing." I felt the weight of every eye on me, pitying, judging, some even agreeing. I wanted to disappear. I tried to tell myself not to take her words to heart, but they were daggers, each one designed to pierce deeper than the last. She called me useless. She called me broke. She wanted to strip me of dignity, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. The worst part wasn't just the insults, it was the way she bragged. She didn't just say I was worthless. She flaunted her supposed victory. She loved to remind me, over and over, that according to her, I would not receive a single cent from my son's will. She repeated it at gatherings like it was a toast to her success. "Oh, the will. Don't worry, she's not in it. She won't get a dime. My husband made sure everything is mine." Each time she said it louder, prouder, as if daring anyone to challenge her, as if daring me to speak up. But I didn't. I couldn't. My grief kept me silent. My love for my son kept me from creating a scene. I didn't want to tarnish his memory by fighting with his widow. So I swallowed my pain. Yet silence, I learned, only fed her arrogance. The closer we came to the reading of the will, the bolder she became. Her arrogance grew like a shadow stretching across the room. She strutted into gatherings wearing new jewelry, flashing handbags, even boasting about renovations she was already planning for her house. She told anyone who would listen that she would soon be set for life, that my son had secured her future, not mine. And every time she laughed about it, she looked straight at me, as if twisting the knife just to see how deep it could go. I could see the smirk in her eyes, the one that said, "You are nothing without him." And soon, everyone will see it. She mocked me in whispers when she thought others weren't listening. She mocked me in shouts when she wanted an audience. I was her entertainment, her example, her proof that she had won some invisible war. And still, I stayed quiet. Deep inside, I knew my son. I knew his heart. And while her arrogance filled the air like poison, a small voice in me whispered, "Wait, the truth will come." But until that day, I endured the humiliation. I endured the sneers, the laughter, the endless reminders that in her eyes, I was useless. At family dinners, I forced myself to chew food that tasted like ash. At birthdays, I smiled through tears. At every gathering, I sat smaller and smaller, as if shrinking could protect me from her cruelty. She thought she had already won. She thought she was untouchable. And as the day of the will reading drew closer, her arrogance only grew stronger. She walked taller, laughed louder, and bragged more openly, convinced the law itself would be her weapon. She didn't know the truth. She didn't know what was waiting for her. And as I watched her bask in her false sense of victory, I held my silence. Because deep down I knew my son would never have wanted this. And the day was coming when she would learn that for herself. The day of the will reading arrived like a storm I had dreaded for weeks. For days leading up to it, I barely slept. My nights were long and restless, filled with memories of my son's smile, the sound of his voice, the way he always promised to take care of me. I clung to those memories like a lifeline, trying to silence the words my daughter-in-law repeated so often. "You won't get a cent." And yet, despite her arrogance, I couldn't help but fear she might be right. The morning sun did little to ease my nerves as I dressed carefully, choosing a simple black dress, one I had worn at the funeral just weeks before. My hands trembled as I buttoned it, and I whispered to myself, "Stay strong. Just stay strong." When I arrived at the lawyer's office, the world felt heavy and cold. The building itself was tall and imposing, with polished glass doors that reflected back a version of me I barely recognized. Tired eyes, shoulders bent with grief, a woman carrying too much loss. Inside, the air smelled of leather and paper, the kind of scent that only comes from years of secrets and signatures. The receptionist guided us to a private room. A long table, neat stacks of folders, pens lined perfectly in a row. At the head of the table sat the lawyer, an older man with kind eyes and a professional calm. He nodded to us both as we entered. We sat down across from one another, me on one side, her on the other. I was nervous, my palms damp, my throat dry. She, on the other hand, looked smug, like a queen about to claim her throne. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs, her designer heels tapping lightly against the polished floor. Her lips curled into that familiar smirk, the one she wore every time she wanted to remind me of my place. As the lawyer shuffled papers, clearing his throat, she glanced at me and whispered, low enough for him not to hear, but sharp enough to pierce my heart. "You'll see. Nothing for you." My stomach twisted into knots. My son's widow, the woman he once loved, was now my tormentor. And I sat there in silence, praying for strength. The lawyer began to read. His voice was steady, professional, as he listed out my son's assets. The house, the cars, the savings accounts, even his personal belongings. Each time an item was declared, her name followed. "To my beloved wife," he read, and she straightened in her chair, her smile widening. She nodded along as if it were already hers, as if the words on the page were just a formality. And each time her name was spoken, she glanced at me with triumph, whispering, "See? Nothing for you." The sound of her voice was poison. I wanted to shout, to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but my heart ached too much. The grief was still raw, the pain too fresh. I couldn't bring myself to fight. Not here, not in this room that carried the weight of my son's last wishes. So I stayed silent. Silent as the lawyer continued. Silent as she smirked. Silent as she leaned closer and whispered again, "It's all mine. You get nothing." Her words echoed in my chest like a cruel drumbeat. I lowered my gaze, staring at my folded hands. They trembled slightly, and I pressed them together to hide it. I thought of all the nights I had prayed over my son's crib, all the mornings I had walked him to school, all the sacrifices I had made just to give him a better life. And now, sitting in that office, it felt as if all of it meant nothing. The lawyer read on, his voice filling the room with the cold reality of legal language, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heart breaking. Still, even in my silence, I held on to one thought. My son loved me. He would never forget me. It was the only comfort I had as the minutes dragged on, as her arrogance filled the room, as my dignity was tested in front of strangers. The reading was far from over, but already the battle lines had been drawn. Her smirks, my silence, and the lawyer's voice carrying the weight of a future I could not yet see. And though my heart ached, though every word felt like another wound, I stayed quiet. Because deep inside, I knew this story was not finished yet. The lawyer's voice had become a steady hum, like the ticking of a clock in a silent room. Each word he read seemed to chip away at me, confirming my daughter-in-law's smug certainty that everything belonged to her. Her smirks, her whispers, her triumphant glances. They cut deeper with every passing moment. And then he stopped. The room grew quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the faint shuffle of paper as the lawyer adjusted the stack before him, and then, slowly, almost deliberately, he lifted his eyes. For the first time since we sat down, he looked directly at me. And in that moment, I saw something. Something subtle, something that did not belong in a room so cold and formal. He smiled. Not a wide smile, not a grin. Just a small, knowing curve of his lips, one that carried weight. One that made my breath catch. When the lawyer paused and smiled, my daughter-in-law's confidence faltered. I saw it. For the first time that day, her smirk flickered. Her body shifted in her chair, and though she tried to hide it, her foot stopped tapping against the polished floor. "What's taking so long?" she asked sharply, her voice tinged with irritation. "We're done here, aren't we?" But the lawyer shook his head. He cleared his throat and said in that calm, professional tone, "There is one last item left." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. My heart skipped. Her head snapped toward him, her confidence returning in an instant. She rolled her eyes dramatically, scoffing loud enough to fill the room. "One last item?" she mocked, her tone dripping with disdain. What could it possibly be? He already gave me everything. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as if the matter were beneath her, but I noticed the faintest tremor in her laugh. For her, this was a performance, a final act to remind me of my place. But for me, it was something more. That smile from the lawyer, it wasn't empty, it wasn't meaningless. It was a sign, a whisper of hope after so many weeks of humiliation and despair. I straightened in my chair for the first time that afternoon. My fingers, which had been clenched tight in my lap, loosened slightly. I forced myself to breathe, slowly, steadily, waiting for whatever words would come next. The lawyer shuffled the papers again, his deliberate pace only heightening the tension. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of the clock on the wall ticking away, seconds that felt like hours. My daughter-in-law huffed impatiently, tapping her nails against the table. "Can we hurry this up?" she muttered. "I have better things to do." Better things to do. The woman who had mocked me, humiliated me, called me useless and broke, now sat across from me, acting as if my son's legacy was just another errand to check off her list. But the lawyer ignored her impatience. His eyes flicked toward me again, almost protective, almost gentle. And then, with that same small smile, he began to read. My heart pounded in my chest. I could feel it in my throat, in my ears, like a drumbeat. "This final item," he said slowly, "was written in my client's own words. He requested that it be read in full." My daughter-in-law scoffed again, waving her hand dismissively. Fine, read it. Let's get this over with. I already know how it ends." But I leaned forward, my entire being focused on the lawyer's lips, waiting for the truth my son had left behind. For weeks I had endured humiliation, endured whispers of, "You're useless, you're broke, you'll get nothing." For weeks she had strutted and bragged, feeding her arrogance on my silence. And now, the lawyer's smile told me the tide was about to turn. He cleared his throat once more, his voice steady, deliberate, carrying the weight of words that were about to change everything. And as he began to speak, the world seemed to hold its breath. The room was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that presses on your chest and steals the air from your lungs. The lawyer's pause stretched long enough to make my daughter-in-law shift uneasily in her chair. She tried to mask it with another smirk, rolling her eyes as if none of this mattered, as if she already knew the ending. But then, the lawyer began to read. His voice was steady, deliberate, carrying the words of my son. Words that cut through the air like lightning. Words that changed everything. "To my beloved wife, I have left you the house, the vehicles, and the savings accounts as already stated. But there is one last clause, one final request that must be honored." The lawyer's eyes flicked toward me as he continued. "I want to make it clear. My mother is not to be left behind. She is not to be forgotten. To her, I leave the investment accounts under my name, along with the shares of my company and full rights to the trust I established before my marriage. This will ensure she is cared for, always." For a moment, the words didn't sink in. I stared at the lawyer, my breath caught in my throat, as though my heart refused to believe what my ears had heard. And then, it hit me. My son had remembered me. He had thought of me, protected me, even from beyond the grave. I felt my chest tighten with a rush of emotion so strong, I almost broke right there at the table. Tears welled in my eyes, but I held them back, clutching the edge of the chair, forcing myself to stay upright. Across from me, my daughter-in-law froze. The color drained from her face, her smugness vanishing in an instant. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She looked as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet, as though the air itself had betrayed her. And then, With the lawyer's final words still echoing in the room, she swayed. Her hand gripped the arm of her chair, her knuckles white. Her eyes rolled back, and within seconds, she fainted. The sound of her body collapsing against the leather seat, the thud of her purse hitting the floor, it all echoed in the heavy silence. The lawyer paused, startled, but I sat still, my hands trembling, my heart pounding with both grief and relief. For weeks she had mocked me. For weeks she had called me useless, broke, a burden. She had humiliated me in front of family, laughed in my face, and sworn I would get nothing. But now, in one breathtaking moment, justice had been served. The lawyer calmly adjusted his glasses, glanced at the fainted woman, and then turned his attention back to me. He spoke gently, almost kindly. Your son wanted to make sure you were always cared for. That was his true wish. Those words broke me. Tears slid down my cheeks, unstoppable now. I pressed a hand to my chest, whispering under my breath, "Thank you, my son. Thank you for not forgetting me." It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the accounts or the shares or the trust. It was about love. It was about knowing that my son, even in death, had remembered me, had valued me, had made sure his mother was not erased. I looked at my daughter-in-law, still unconscious in her chair, and for the first time in weeks, I felt no anger, no bitterness, only justice. She had tried to strip me of dignity. She had thrown me out of my own home, called me worthless, paraded her supposed victory in front of me. She thought she had won. But she didn't know my son. She didn't know the depth of his love, the quiet strength of his loyalty, the promises he had made long before she ever came into his life. Now, here in this office, the truth had been revealed. My son had not forgotten me. Justice had finally been served. I sat there in silence, tears sliding down my face, my heart full for the first time since the funeral. The pain of loss was still there, the grief still heavy, but it was no longer poisoned by betrayal. It was softened by love, the love of a son who had kept his promise. And as I left that office, walking out into the sunlight with my head held a little higher, I whispered to myself, "He remembered me. He always remembered me." Because in the end, it wasn't her laughter or her cruelty that defined this story. It was his love, his final gift, his final revelation. And it was enough to heal my broken heart. As I stepped out of that lawyer's office, the cool air hit my face, and for the first time in weeks, I could finally breathe. The weight of betrayal, the humiliation, the sleepless nights, all of it seemed to fade in that moment. Yes, I had suffered. Yes, my heart had been broken, not just by the loss of my son, but by the cruelty of the woman he once loved. She had tried to erase me, to cast me aside like I was nothing, to spit on the bond between a mother and her child. But justice has a way of finding its place. My son's love reached me beyond the grave. His voice spoke through those pages, reminding me that he had never forgotten me, not for a single second. In that final revelation, I found not just financial security, but something far more precious: dignity, respect, proof that I still mattered. And as for her, my daughter-in-law learned the cost of her arrogance, the cost of her cruelty. She fainted at the very weight of the truth she thought she could bury. So I leave you with this. Never underestimate a mother's place in her child's heart. Even in death, love has a way of speaking louder than hate.